We've raised $13 billion at $183 billion post-money valuation. This investment, led by Iconic Capital, will help us expand our capacity, improve model capabilities, and deepen our safety research. What a raise. I still have sticker shock when I see numbers of this size for companies that are losing money faster than they're making it. On one hand, I get it. On the other hand, it's terrifying. And the question that comes to mind is, what are they going to spend $13 billion on? Also, how does this compare to the valuation of OpenAI? Because they recently raised too. It seems more and more like AI is becoming a cash war more than anything before it. We've had previous markets where people would spend their money to price out competition, like when Amazon would sell products for cheaper than they were worth in order to kill competitors in those specific spaces. But this is a new level. There's a lot worth digging into here, from what the valuation means to the $1 billion run rate that they're talking about here, to the utter chaos of how expensive training models has become. And hopefully, if all goes well, Anthropic might actually fix their capacity issues too. I'm excited to dive into all of this, but I didn't just raise $13 billion, so quick word from today's sponsor, and then we'll dive right in. I'm going to be honest with you guys, I haven't been using GitHub much lately. I know that sounds crazy, but I'm still using the platform. I'm just not opening github.com because it's kind of useless. If you've spent a lot of time browsing GitHub or even just trying to get code reviews done, it feels like it's falling apart. It's such a painful experience, which is why today's sponsor has been so important to me. Graphite has fundamentally changed how I do code review. I no longer fear it. I'm honestly a little bit excited about it. It's just so much better. And to be very clear, it's still on top of GitHub. You bring your GitHub repos and your GitHub orgs to Graphite, and it works on top. You don't even have to use it. You can hop between the two. But I haven't been finding myself hopping around a whole lot lately because I'm just so much happier on Graphite. They have a best-in-class inbox. Like, how crazy is it that there isn't a good inbox on GitHub still? There are Vim-based hotkeys for navigating around. It flies. They now have the option to cache your repos, so things load even faster than they do on GitHub. The chat's actually really cool too. You can ask it questions about the PR to get information as you're reviewing, and it makes things so much easier. I'm still not over the hotkeys though. You can press the brackets to open things up. There's a stack view, so if you chain PRs on top of each other, it's just how the flow works, which is huge if you have a team shipping fast and not wanting to get blocked. Like, if I have somebody waiting to merge a PR, they should be able to keep building on top of it without making reviews harder or merging harder later on. All of this is just how Graphite works. It's a code review platform built around modern teams shipping modern speeds. Be it a small startup like T3 Chat or a huge one like Shopify, so many businesses are seeing the value, and I bet you will too. Check them out today at soitiv.link/graphite. These are the core pieces I want to talk about with this. There's obviously a lot of layers to any investment like this. I'm going to sneak one more in. The firm who invested, because Iconic, they're not bad, but they're an interesting choice. So let's start first and foremost with this really big number, the $183 billion. So what's interesting about this raise is the ratio. When a company does a fundraise like this, there's an agreement between the company and the investors for a valuation. The valuation isn't real in the sense that it's not stock you can go sell and make that money off of. When you're this far in, you are getting real stock, though. I've talked a lot in other videos about safe investment. Safe investment is an IOU system where if the company ends up worth less, you get more stock to balance out your investment cost. But once you're investing in Series A onwards, it almost always moves over to convertible notes or traditional like stock purchases like you would expect from traditional investment. So this $13 billion going in has actually resulted in stock being purchased by the company investing. The post-money part is not too important a detail. It basically means that the 13 bill is included in this val. So they're actually worth 170 bill. But once they're handed the 13 bill, they now have more money, so they're worth more. Just makes the math a little easier. So that's 13 divided by 183 equals about 7% of the company for 13 billion. That is really, really good and really low dilution. I talked about this a ton in a recent video about not working at a startup. It's not out yet, but hopefully will be very soon if you want more detail. I don't want to waste too much time here going into it. But every time a company raises money, dilution occurs, which means that more stock is created, which makes the rest of the stock worth less. So if the company starts with 10 million shares of stock, and it's split between me and my co-founder, we both have 5 million shares, we both have 50%. Then an investor comes in and buys 15%. That means new stock is created to give them. We still have 5 million shares each, but the value of those shares as a percentage of the company has gone down, but the value of the company's gone up to counteract it. Every raise should result in the valuation of the company going up, but also with more stock being created, the percentage you own goes down. So you might start with 50%, after the first raise be down to like 42, the next raise be down to 35, the next raise be down to 30, the next raise be down to 25, but each of those should add a lot of valuation to the company, sometimes even a digit. So like, I personally would rather own 70% of a company that's worth $100 million than 100% of a company that's worth $5 million. That's the basics of how dilution works. As new investors come in, new stock is created. Your stock is the same. You have as many shares as you had before, but the percentage of the company that represents goes down. It's not like I'm taking something away from you when I raise money and create new stock. It's the creation of the new stock that results in everyone's shares being a smaller percentage. As a founder and a CEO and an exec, it's your goal to limit dilution as much as possible without blocking the valuation going up, as well as the money that you need to do the things you want to do. As we've all probably experienced with Anthropic, they don't have enough capacity. It's basically a known fact that if you want to use Anthropic models and you want them to be reliable, you should be using them on multiple hosts and not just Anthropic's APIs. Thankfully, you can use Claude models on things like Google Vertex on GCP, as well as Bedrock on AWS. So you have options to diversify where your Claude hosting is to keep their much less stable platform from holding you back. Still not fun, but that's reality. They need a lot more GPUs if they want to have their infra platform competitive. But they also need those GPUs for training. Something I have heard from a handful of people is that Anthropic struggles a lot with prioritization with their GPUs, like how much should be going towards training versus how much should be going towards providing APIs for users. They really are a deep tech lab that wants to make good models, and everything else is kind of secondary. And if you don't believe me, go try the Claude.ai website. You'll quickly understand what I'm referring to. It's just not a good user experience because it's not their priority. If I recall, there was even a point where they were outsourcing the development of it to another company because they just didn't want to deal with the website. They just wanted to focus on making models. But now there's an expectation that they provide infra, and there is an increasingly large need for GPUs in order to train these models in the first place. Every major bump for a model like GPT-3 to 4 to 5 often is a 10x in the amount of compute needed and the amount of energy used to train the new model. This was a post I saw on Hacker News that I thought did a good, humorous way of summarizing the situation. Thank you, Llama Sushi. The compute mode is getting absolutely insane. We're basically at the point where you need a small country's GDP just to stay in the game for one more generation of models. What gets me is that this isn't even a software moat anymore. It's literally just whoever can get their hands on enough GPUs and power infrastructure. TSMC and the power companies are the real kingmakers here. You can have all the talent in the world, but if you can't get 100,000 H100s in a dedicated power plant, you're out. I actually did the math because I have a 5090 in one of my rigs here. I've been running a lot of random stuff on it. I wanted to figure out how much it would cost if I just ran it 24/7 for a month. The electricity cost alone would be over $200 a month. Yes, energy in SF in California isn't particularly cheap, but it's at best twice the price of other places in the US. US electricity is maybe able to go down by 50%, but the fact that running a consumer gaming GPU 24/7 would cost at least $100 a month anywhere in the US is hilarious. That means that in a year-ish, you have hit the MSRP of the card, just in energy cost. So yeah, electricity is a big piece here that isn't accounted for enough. I've also recently nerd sniped myself on the whole AI uses too much water thing. Not only is it entirely bullshit, but power usage is a much bigger problem. The usage of water in the energy sources that these AI companies are doing, that is a much, much bigger deal than the water usage of the AI companies directly themselves. And I agree, we need better ways to get energy, but that's a whole separate video for another time. Back to this post, though, because I really did like this. I wonder how much of the $13 billion is just prepaying for compute versus actual operation expenses. If it's mostly compute, we're watching something weird happen, like the privatization of Manhattan Project scale infra, except instead of enriching uranium, we're computing gradient descents. The wildest part is we might look back at this as cheap. GPT-4 training was what, 100 billion? GPT-5 and Opus 4 class are probably 1 billion plus in training. At this rate, GPT-7 will need its own sovereign wealth fund. Actually, though, it's pretty hilarious how expensive this has gotten and how much you need the money to do it. So let's think in the mind of Dario. We are going to pretend we are Dario. We are the founder of Anthropic. We know a couple things. We know devs love our models. We also know that we have to keep up with the other labs as they're shipping new models. We've also become painfully aware that with every new model generation, it gets more expensive to train a model. And most importantly, we know that we're out of GPUs. Not literally out, but they've very much allocated everything that they have. So they know all of this stuff. They know that they want to keep up with Google and OpenAI. I should include that as well. Google and OpenAI have a nearly infinite war chest of cash. Since Google and OpenAI have so much money ready to go for all the stuff that they're doing, they're very well positioned. When I say Google and OpenAI have nearly infinite cash, I kind of mean it. OpenAI's recent raise was $40 billion on a $300 billion valuation. They just got another $8 billion, though. We don't even know the cap for that one yet. It's still like just happening. They've raised about $54 billion total across all of the different fundraising and grants and whatnot that they've gotten. Like they started with the grant from YC and Peter Thiel and Musk and whatnot. They've raised 52 to 55 bill total. So that's cash that was raised with the explicit goal of spending it to position OpenAI better, to advance their research, advance their position in their market, and help them do well. And it's clearly working because they're currently making $13 billion a year in revenue. That doesn't mean they're profitable. It doesn't mean they're making $13 billion with no cost. That's the amount of money being spent on OpenAI services that comes in from external customers. Over time, they can reduce their costs, of course, and as models get better and more efficient, theoretically, this could become an incredibly profitable company. If they really had to right now, I bet they could. But their focus is on growth at all costs, which is why they raised another $40 billion, because they're spending more than this $13 billion a year, and they want to keep ramping up the spend so they can buy more GPUs, train more models, put out more services, hire more people, acquire more companies that they've been doing a lot of recently. We'll talk about that in a new video soon. And also the craziest part here, they were only at $10 billion a year in June. So in 3 months, they've increased their yearly revenue by $3 billion. That's $1 billion a year in growth every month. Kind of insane. And then there's Google, whose market cap is almost $3 trillion. That's 10x the value of OpenAI. And that's actual stock that's liquid that they can sell. So Google's fine. Google can spend whatever the fuck they want to. They've even built their own processors and their own TPUs for doing a lot of their stuff. So they're in a good spot with the whole Tensor platform. I've been hearing rumors that they're not actually able to make enough chips, and they're using other chips for a lot of inference now because theirs literally just aren't able to be manufactured fast enough. But regardless, they have a very good positioning, both short and long term. Anthropic did a podcast recently with the Stripe guys and had some good quotes. Socrates dropped this one here. There's two different ways you could describe what's happening in the model business. Let's say in 2023, you train a model that costs $100 million, and then you deploy it in 2024. And it makes $200 million of revenue. Meanwhile, because of the scaling laws, in 2024, you also train a model that costs $1 billion. And then in 2025, you get $2 billion in revenue from that $1 billion. But now you're spending $10 billion to train the next model. That's the thing that's so interesting, is if you spend this crazy amount of money, it takes a year to make the thing. You might make 2x back, but you have to spend 10x more for the next year. It's pretty nuts. But there are other pieces I want to really dig into here. The big one is the ratio difference here, because we see 40 bill on 300 bill. That's a bit over 10%, especially if they just took another 8 bill. We'll just pretend that's over the same 300. This 40 bill cost OpenAI around 16% of the company. So OpenAI gave up 16% to raise 48 bill. Anthropic looked at things a little different. They again went back to their current knowledge. They know devs love their models. They have to fight if they want to keep up. Models are getting more expensive. They need more GPUs. Google and OpenAI have a nearly infinite amount of cash. But of course, as any good business person wants to, they really want to limit dilution. They don't want to just give away the whole company to random external parties and investors, because investors generally kind of suck. So ideally, you avoid giving up too much to them. And 7% dilution is a really, really low number. Again, OpenAI had to give up 16% of their company for their last raise. When investors are throwing in these 10 bill plus numbers, as silly as it sounds, the difference between 10 billion and 30 billion for a lot of these giant late stage investors isn't very big. they're not thinking about these numbers, as crazy as that might sound. They're thinking about the long term. They're thinking about having 10% of 3 trillion, because 10% of 3 trillion is $300 billion. So this kind of gets wiped out if that happens. So most of these investors are down to put in more money as long as they get a higher percentage. I can virtually guarantee that Iconic would have been very excited to put 26 bill in instead and get 14%. They would have loved to do that. But Anthropic doesn't want more money. They want enough money, and they want to limit dilution. So you kind of have to balance these things out when you're raising. You have to balance out how much money do you need? How high is too high for your valuation? How much dilution are you willing to take? You got to kind of balance these 3 pieces: the money, the valuation, and the dilution. If it seems like you just want the valuation to be as high as possible, right? Kind of. If the valuation goes too high and then you have to raise again and you can't raise that same valuation, or you can't go higher, then you kind of screwed yourself. There's a great clip from Silicon Valley about this and the down round. I'm scared to play it because it might get us demonetized. But the fact that if you raise at too high a val and then you run out of money and need more, you have to raise at a lower valuation. That means that your previous investors are going to be pissed and try to like claw back a higher percentage. Like if you raise at 200 bill and you sell 10% at 200 bill, and then you're out of money, you need more, but you can only raise at 100 bill. Even if you only sell 5% at that point, your investors from the 200 bill round are going to be pounding at your door, and they might even have terms that they've agreed to where if the value goes lower before you IPO or before you sell, we get a higher percentage back. So that 200 bill at 10% might convert to 20% instead. So taking that lower round might get you a little more money, but you also just gave up 15% of your company instead of 5%. So these are the things you have to consider. So you have to make sure you're getting the money you need to fight, but not too much, because then you're increasing dilution. You want a high valuation in order to lower the dilution, but not too high, because then you won't be able to raise money in the future. And it's this weird tug of war between these 3 different pieces that you have to consider when you're raising. And the stakes are a hell of a lot higher when we're talking about $200+ billion companies. So now the natural question is, who the fuck is Iconic? I've vaguely heard about these guys, and honestly, I understand. I tend to be much earlier stage. I invest in companies when they're worth less than $100 million, not when they're worth billions. I don't think I've ever written a check to a company with a valuation over 300 mil. Usually I invest when they're worth 20 to 30. And here we can see all of the different companies that they've invested in. Most of these are things I've never heard of, with the occasional one that I have, like Canva, Calendly, Databricks, Datadog, Fastly, Figma, Epic. Investing in Epic Games is actually really hard. They don't raise much. They got in on Uber. It feels like everyone got in on Uber at some point. But this is a very small number of companies. Like I've invested in a similar number of companies, but I'm investing significantly smaller amounts. I don't own percentages of anything. I own like 0.005 or 0.001% of these businesses. Apparently they were in FTX, which is hilarious. What happens when I click the AI button? Not much smaller. They are putting Notion in as an AI company and GitLab as well, to be fair, but interesting. The point I'm trying to make here is that these guys come in later and invest very large amounts. There are 3 general types of investors in private startups. There is early stage, there's growth PMF stage, probably has other names, but I don't care. And there's late stage. For a quick company to reference, this is Scale AI. This is the company that just had like 50% of their equity bought out by Meta in order for them to acquire the CEO and a bit of the team and pull them over. It was a very interesting round. But if we look here, we can't see the valuations. That tends to not be public, but we can see how much money they raised, and we can usually infer what the valuations were at these points in time. So the seed round was 120K. They probably sold around 10% of the company here. So imagine that we got in then. So if we're talking about Scale AI, and again, we don't know the caps, we just know what they raised here. We'll say the 120K was over 1.2 mil, which would make that 10%. Almost immediately afterwards, Excel comes in. Excel's a really good firm. They mostly do early to mid stage. They'll come in during the seed, like right after somebody comes through YC, occasionally, but they're more focused on Series A. So here they raised 4.5 mil. At this point, I would argue they're between the two, but we'll just say they're at this stage now. Let's say it was 4.5 mil over 50 mil. I'll do 45 to just keep the percentages easy for myself. Again, we're making up the other number. So the first investors early stage spent $120,000 and got 10%. The next stage spent $4.5 million and got the same percentage. To be fair, that did dilute these early investors a little bit, but not a lot. In fact, actually, no, if those were safe investments, they would actually convert at the same. So no, that would be 10% for real. Cool. So these two parties, even though one spent 120K, one spent 4.5 mil, have the same percentage of the company now. Now let's go much later to like Series F, where Excel actually came back in, crazy enough, and invested $1 billion. So now it's 1 billion over, let's say 10 bill, just to keep the math nice and easy. Now you have to spend $1 billion if you want 10% of the company. But then there is the final stage, the exit. This is the IPO. This is the company selling. This is a lot of different things. Scale had a weird exit because they like half sold to Meta. Meta bought half of the equity from Scale, which made them a $29 billion company because they spent $14.3 billion for 49%. So now at the exit, we'll just say they're worth $29 billion. If you bought in late stage, you just converted $1 billion to $2.9 billion. So they 2.9x'd by investing at this stage. But if you invested in the growth, like early growth PMF stage, you 6,400x'd what you put in. But if you got an early stage, you 240,000x'd. So again, when you invest early stage, you have the potential to have a massive, absurd return. And as you go later stage, the size of that return as a multiplier goes down. But the more important thing is the likelihood that the company succeeds as they go down these stages. The early stage companies fail like 99% plus of the time. It's almost a guarantee that when you're investing in companies this stage, that they're gonna fail. But if you get in the right one early enough, you can easily 200 to 200,000x your money. And to be fair, the dilution would have hit and knocked that 10% down to like 8, maybe 5, worst case. You still 120,000x your money. We're still talking about billions of dollars for a $120,000 investment. Once you get into this stage, failure rate goes down a bit. You can argue how much, depends on a lot of different things, but the failure rate does go down. And once you get to this stage, it goes down quite a bit. So as you go further in, you are de-risking, but also massively decreasing the potential multiplier for what you're investing in. So each of these stages has different parties that focus on it. Y Combinator is exclusively on this early stage. They put in 500K and they get 7 to 10% of your company. That's what they do. They will not negotiate on that. They make their money. These growth and PMF ones tend to be more firms like Founders Fund, A16Z, Excel, Sequoia. But these ones, more and more so, especially the bottom three, tend to drift into late stage. Usually any given investor will drift a little down the chain. Even I'm guilty of this to an extent, where Y Combinator is obviously very focused on early stage, but they tried doing a growth fund where they would invest in the best YC companies during their Series A stuff. They've largely stopped doing that, but they did for a while maintain a growth fund for the handful of companies they wanted to invest in as they got here. A16, Excel, and Sequoia are all similar, where they might not jump on a company they've never worked with before in a later stage investment or raise. But if Excel knows how good Scale AI is, and they have $1 billion around to commit, and they genuinely think there's a 90% plus chance they're going to 3x that money, they're more than happy to throw it in. And then there are these late stage folks. These guys are a different breed. I'm honestly not as familiar with them because it's just so far from the section of this ecosystem I live in. But that's going to be companies like Iconic, the one we're just talking about here for Anthropic. It's going to be companies like SoftBank, the Japanese investment firm that did a bunch of questionable investments, including the Builder AI guys that were the India scam. They also invested, I believe, in FTX. I am positive that they invested in WeWork really heavily. They're the ones who gave WeWork the lifeline that they spent billions of dollars of and then failed. So they have questionable investments, but they've also made crazy return on a handful too. They have a lot of conviction for their late stage. It's SoftBank's actually really interesting because they kind of act like Y Combinator, where they take wild bets, but they're doing it at a crazy stage. Like they're not betting $100,000 to $500,000 on something weird. They're betting $2 to $10 billion instead. And when you look at this other $8 billion OpenAI is raising, you see this Dragoneer investment group, which seems to be a fund that is getting money from various other more traditional financial groups and then pouring that into these startups that they might not be able to talk to. Like Blackstone or Fidelity might not be able to invest in OpenAI directly, but if Dragoneer goes to them and says, hey, we have 8 billion of allocation that we can invest into OpenAI. If you want part, give it to us and we'll invest on your behalf as a fund. It seems like Dragoneer kind of just went and talked to everybody that would want to get into OpenAI but can't, contributed 2.8 bill of their own money, and then all these others came in as well as part of this extra 8 bill being raised. And the other 40 bill was, of course, SoftBank. But again, with these late stage investments, usually they, as I said before, don't care too much about the distinction between 10 bill and 30 bill because they want a percentage. They're willing to spend absurd money in order to have a potential absurd return. So when SoftBank goes in for one of these as a relatively iconic, nice to work with firm, they're not going to take less than the percentage they want. So they fought with OpenAI to make sure the valuation and the money given was a good enough balance to get them at least their 10%. And they did. They gave 40 bill for a 300 bill valuation. That puts them a little over 10%. I'm sure they're more than happy with that. But Dario wanted to fight. Dario did the ballsy thing of raising at a less than 10% dilution cap for this round. 7% dilution this late stage and for billions of dollars is really nuts. But that was a decision he made because he just wanted the money to continue going. And my guess is the reason he went with Iconic is they were the late stage firm that was willing to commit 13 billion that wouldn't fight really hard to get a higher percentage. And I'm assuming he shopped around and talked to these other firms as he was trying to figure out how to get the amount of money he needed to buy all the GPUs they need and spend all of the money on all the training they want to do for the next generation of models. Because this next generation is going to cost at least 10 bill to train. And he doesn't have 10 bill around to spend. So how can you get that 10 bill that you need with as little dilution as possible? You talk to a bunch of firms and you find the one that's willing to bend over the most. And that's what they did with Iconic, which is particularly interesting because the 183 billion post-val puts them at over half the valuation of OpenAI. Personally, I don't really care how you feel about Anthropic versus OpenAI. I think we can all agree that OpenAI is at least twice as valuable, if not more so, than Anthropic right now. I would argue that OpenAI's chance of success and potential valuation is probably 5 to 10 times higher than Anthropic's is right now, especially. Count for my biases. I obviously like the OpenAI guys a lot. Anthropic's actually bridged the gap with me a bit too, and I'm proud of them for doing that. They've invited me to the office to go hang with some people, higher up people even. They want to fix the weird vibes I've been getting. But at the same time, I have much more confidence in OpenAI's ability to deliver long-term and also scale their revenue. Again, $1 bill a month of additional revenue for 3 months straight, from 10 to 13 bill a year in 3 months is insane. That's actually absurd. Compounding growth is wild. So I think the 183 bill is a high valuation for where they're at and what they're doing. But if they do succeed, then next year they'll be worth 400 bill and they can do this again. And that's kind of the bet they're making, is if they do this and they get this money, they will stay relevant next year and they can raise on an even higher valuation as this bubble continues to grow. And if it turns out the bubble can't keep growing and it's going to burst instead, then none of this mattered anyways. They weren't going to survive. So this is a bet on the continued growth and scaling of this entire industry. And even then, Dario hedged and gave up as little a percentage as possible, which means previous investors keep more, he keeps more, employees keep more. And I hope he's letting some of those employees do exits here too. Or if you were a day one Anthropic person and now your equity is technically worth $200 million, but you can't do anything with it. It's not uncommon for these raises, these late stage ones in particular, to allow for employees to do some secondary market sales of their equity in order to finally have some cash in the bank. So I would assume they're doing some of that here too. I know Anthropic's been really good about that stuff overall. Regardless, crazy to do this at 7% dilution. Crazy that their valuation is so close to OpenAI's. Crazy that their downtime is still as bad as it is, considering how much money they have. They got at best 2 nines of reliability. It's time to fix it. Oh, and man, don't get me started on the fact that Opus 4.1 was on some broken mode and was parameterized for 6 days straight. So the model just wasn't behaving for almost a week. And nobody noticed until someone had a viral tweet and got a bunch of shit for it. And it turned out they were right. Oh, they needed GPUs badly. They also need better monitoring and they need a lot of other little things. But regardless, They have the money. This is going to be interesting. I have no idea where this is going to go. I'm excited to see how things ramp up, and I am hopeful that this enables Anthropic to make their info more reliable and continue to train better models. The bubble might burst immediately. It might keep going. It's impossible to know for sure, but it's been exciting at the very least. Hopefully, Anthropic's lawyers don't break my other arm for this video. Let me know what you guys think, and until next time, peace, nerds.